The sun hung heavy in the Kansas sky as Preston Jacobsen strained to hear the auctioneer's rapid-fire chant over the crowd's murmurs. It was 1874, and the June heat pressed down on Ellsworth like an iron skillet. Preston hadn't come to town for the auction. He'd needed supplies for his ranch 10 miles outside of town, but the commotion in the square had drawn him like a moth to flame. Now, as he stood at the back of the gathering, his stomach turned at what he witnessed. Next up, gentlemen. A fine domestic servant, just arrived from back east. Young, healthy, and skilled with needle and cooking pot alike. The woman on the makeshift platform stared at her feet, her auburn hair hanging limply around her face. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, and though her dress was modest, Preston could see it had once been fine, now travel-worn and soiled. She wasn't a slave. Slavery had ended years ago with the war. But indentured servants, women sold to pay family debts, and mail-order brides arrived regularly on the frontier, their humanity reduced to dollar values. Starting bid at $50. Do I hear 50? Preston gripped his hat tighter. He'd built his ranch from nothing after returning from the war, working himself to exhaustion daily, but maintaining one principle. No man or woman would ever be treated as property on his land. Yet here was a woman being sold like livestock. $50 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 60? Thorne. Preston's jaw clenched. Jedediah Thorne owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had a reputation for working his hands nearly to death and treating his domestic help worse. 60, someone called. 70, Thorne countered immediately. The bidding continued, the price rising as the woman kept her eyes downcast. When it reached $100 with Thorne in the lead, Preston felt something inside him snap. $200, he called out, his voice carrying across the square. The crowd turned, murmuring in surprise. Preston Jacobsen was known to be fair but frugal. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $200 from Mr. Jacobsen. Do I hear 220? Thorne turned, his face twisted with annoyance. $250, he spat. Preston stepped forward, moving through the crowd. $300. $350, Thorne countered. $500. Preston's voice was steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. A hush fell over the crowd. $500 was a small fortune on the frontier, enough to buy a decent parcel of land or several head of prime cattle. Thorne's face reddened. He stared at Preston for a long moment before turning away with a curse. He wouldn't go higher, not even to satisfy his pride. $500 going once, twice, sold to Mr. Jacobsen. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack. Only then did the woman look up, her gaze meeting Preston's across the square. Her eyes weren't defeated as he'd expected, but fiery, defiant, and utterly terrified. He approached the platform as the auctioneer handed him a bill of sale. The transaction complete, Preston finally stood before the woman. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Josephine James," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her circumstances. "Miss James, I'm Preston Jacobsen. I own a ranch outside of town." He hesitated. "I'd like to take you there now, if that's acceptable." She gave a bitter laugh. "As if I have a choice in the matter, Mr. Jacobsen." He lowered his voice. "You always have a choice, Miss James, always." The wagon ride out to Preston's ranch was mostly silent. Josephine sat rigidly beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her posture so straight it must have been painful. Preston had untied her wrists immediately after the auction, but the angry red marks remained. Every so often, she would rub at them absently. "It's about 10 miles to my place," Preston said eventually, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Not much to look at, but it's peaceful." "How many others do you have?" she asked abruptly. Others, other women, servants, however you prefer to classify us. Her voice was cold, precise. Preston's grip tightened on the reins. None, Miss James. I have no servants, indentured or otherwise. I manage the ranch myself, with the help of 2 hired hands, both paid fair wages. She turned to study him then, skepticism plain on her face. Then why would you pay $500 for me? He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Because Jedediah Thorne is not known for his kindness to those in his power. So you fancy yourself a rescuer of damsels? Her voice held a sharp edge. No, madam. I fancy myself someone who couldn't stand by and watch another human being sold like cattle. He paused. Once we reach my ranch, you're free to go. I'll even provide you with money for passage wherever you want to go. Or if you prefer, you can stay on as paid help until you decide what you want to do. The choice is yours. She didn't respond, but he felt her studying him with those keen eyes. Preston didn't elaborate further. He'd said his piece, and the rest was up to her. The Jacobsen ranch came into view as they crested a gentle hill, a modest but well-built cabin with a barn and corral behind it, nestled in a verdant valley with a creek running alongside it. Cattle grazed on the hillside, and in the distance, the silhouettes of 2 riders could be seen moving among them. It's not much, Preston said as he guided the horses toward the cabin. But it's mine. It's lovely, Josephine said softly, almost to herself. He helped her down from the wagon, noticing how she winced slightly when her feet touched the ground. Her shoes, though once fine, were worn through in places. Let me show you inside, he said. You must be tired and hungry. The cabin was simple but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, wooden table with chairs, and a small sitting area with a bookshelf surprisingly full of books. 2 doors led off to what Josephine presumed were bedrooms. You can take my room, Preston said, opening one of the doors to reveal a neatly made bed, washstand, and chest of drawers. I'll sleep in the bunkhouse with my hands for now. Josephine stood in the doorway, not entering. Mr. Jacobsen, I don't understand. You spent $500 to purchase my indenture, and now you're giving me your bed and offering me freedom. What exactly do you want from me? Preston removed his hat, running a hand through his sand-colored hair. I want nothing from you, Miss James, except perhaps the knowledge that I didn't leave you to Thorne's mercies. I meant what I said. You're free to go, or free to stay as paid help. Either way, I'll make sure you have what you need. She studied his face for any sign of deception. Why should I believe you? You have no reason to, he acknowledged. But I hope in time you'll see I'm a man of my word. He gestured to the bedroom. Rest. Wash up if you like. I'll prepare something to eat and we can talk more after you've had some time to yourself. Left alone in Preston's bedroom, Josephine finally allowed herself to sag against the wall, exhaustion overtaking her. 3 weeks of travel from Philadelphia, the last of her money spent on train fare west, only to be detained in Kansas City for her father's debts. She'd been told she would work as a governess for a respectable family, a lie that became apparent when she found herself on that auction block in Ellsworth. She examined the room cautiously. The bed was sturdy, with clean linens. A small window looked out over rolling grassland toward distant hills. On the washstand sat a pitcher of water, a basin, and a bar of soap that smelled faintly of cedar. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, the cool water a blessing against her skin. In the chest, she found a man's shirt, clean but worn soft with age. After hesitating briefly, she changed out of her filthy traveling dress into the shirt, which hung to her knees. She used her petticoat as a makeshift skirt beneath it. It wasn't proper, but it was clean, and for now, that was enough. When she emerged from the bedroom, Preston was at the stove, stirring something that smelled rich and savory. He glanced up, then quickly averted his eyes from her makeshift attire. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "My dress is hardly fit to wear." "Not at all," he replied, still focused on the pot before him. "I'll ride into town tomorrow and see about getting you some proper clothes." "With what money?" she asked. "You've already spent a small fortune on me," he shrugged. "The ranch does well enough. Cattle prices are good this year." She sat at the table, watching him work. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to cooking for himself, nothing fancy but competent. "Stew's about ready," he said. "It's just beef and potatoes, I'm afraid. I wasn't expecting company." "It smells wonderful," she said truthfully. She couldn't remember the last proper meal she'd had. They ate in relative silence, Josephine too hungry to maintain conversation, Preston seemingly content to let her eat in peace. The stew was simple but hearty, and the bread he served alongside it was fresh enough. "How long have you been in Kansas?" she asked finally, setting down her spoon. 8 years, he replied. "Came west after the war. Worked as a ranch hand until I saved enough to buy this place 3 years ago." "You fought in the war," he nodded. "Union cavalry, nothing heroic, just did my part." "My brother died at Antietam," she said quietly. Preston's face softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss James. Please call me Josephine or Josie if you prefer. After all this, Miss James seems rather formal." "Josie, then, and I'm Preston." "How did you end up at that auction today, Preston?" she asked. He set down his coffee cup. "Pure chance. I was in town for supplies when I heard the commotion." His jaw tightened. "I've seen such things before, but it still turns my stomach. Why did you bid on me?" "I told you yes to save me from Thorne, but why me specifically? There must have been other auctions, other women." Preston was quiet for a moment. "There was something about you," he said finally. "You looked defeated but not broken, like you were biding your time." He met her eyes. "I respected that." Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you for the meal," she said, rising from the table, "and for everything else." He stood as well. "You're welcome to anything in the house. I'll be in the bunkhouse if you need anything. Just ring that bell by the door and I'll hear it." After he left, Josephine explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelf held volumes of poetry, history, and surprisingly, several novels. The second bedroom was small and sparsely furnished, clearly used for storage more than sleeping. The main room showed signs of a solitary life, a single chair pulled close to the fireplace, a pair of boots by the door, a gun rack with a rifle and shotgun carefully placed. It was a bachelor's home, simple but dignified. Nothing like the opulent house she'd grown up in Philadelphia, but far better than what might have awaited her at Thorne's ranch. She shuddered at the thought. As darkness fell, Josephine climbed into Preston's bed, surprised by its comfort. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she contemplated her situation. Preston seemed sincere in his offer of freedom, but experience had taught her to be wary of men's promises. Still, something about his straightforward manner and quiet dignity made her want to trust him. She would give it a few days, she decided. Rest, regain her strength, then decide her next move. With that thought, she finally drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. Morning came with the sound of men's voices outside and the smell of coffee brewing. Josephine dressed quickly in her makeshift outfit and stepped into the main room to find Preston setting the table. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time, thank you," she replied. "Is there anything I can help with?" "No need. Breakfast is simple eggs and biscuits. Coffee's hot if you'd like some." They ate together, and Josephine found herself studying Preston in the morning light. He was perhaps 30, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. His features were strong rather than handsome, but his eyes were kind, crinkling at the corners when he smiled. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements deliberate and efficient. "I need to ride into town for those supplies I never got yesterday," he said as they finished eating. "And to see about some proper clothes for you. Is there anything specific you need?" she considered. "A few simple dresses, undergarments, perhaps some thread and needles so I can mend them as needed." He nodded. "I'll do my best. I'm not exactly knowledgeable about women's attire." "I've written down my sizes," she said, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "Perhaps the shopkeeper can assist you." "Thank you." He tucked the paper into his shirt pocket. "My hands, Tom and Micah, are working the north pasture today. They know you're here, but they won't bother you. There's food in the pantry if you get hungry before I return." After Preston left, Josephine set about exploring the ranch. The day was warm but pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. She walked down to the creek, enjoying the feel of sun on her face after weeks of travel and confinement. The water was clear and cool, and she sat on the bank watching small fish dart beneath the surface. From this vantage point, she could see much of Preston's land, rolling hills dotted with cattle, stretching toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way so different from Philadelphia's manicured parks and formal gardens. She continued her exploration, finding a small vegetable garden behind the cabin that showed signs of neglect. Without conscious thought, she began pulling weeds, loosening the soil around struggling tomato and bean plants. The physical labor felt good after so much enforced idleness. By mid-afternoon, the garden was looking considerably better, though still far from thriving. Josephine had dirt under her fingernails and sweat on her brow, but she felt more like herself than she had in months. She was washing her hands at the pump when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Preston returned leading a packhorse laden with supplies. He dismounted, his eyebrows rising at the sight of her dirt-smudged appearance. "I found your garden," she explained, somewhat sheepishly. "It seemed in need of attention." "That it was," he agreed. "I'm better with cattle than vegetables, I'm afraid." He began unloading packages, and Josephine moved to help him. Among the usual supplies were several parcels wrapped in brown paper. "Clothes," he explained, handing them to her. "Mrs. Turner at the general store helped me select them. Said they should fit based on what you wrote, but they can be altered if needed." Josephine took the packages, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Preston. I'll repay you once I'm able." "There's no need," he said, his voice gruff. "Consider it part of your freedom." Inside the cabin, she unwrapped the packages to find 3 simple but well-made dresses, proper undergarments, a nightgown, and even a pair of sturdy boots in her size. There was also a small sewing kit with needles, thread, and scissors. The clothing wasn't fashionable by Philadelphia standards, but it was practical and of good quality. She changed into one of the dresses, a blue cotton that fit surprisingly well, and went to help Preston with the remaining supplies. He looked up as she emerged, a flash of something appreciation, crossing his face before he returned to his task. "It fits well," she said, smoothing the skirt. "Mrs. Turner knows her business," he replied. "Blue suits you." Over the next few days, they established a tentative routine. Preston rose before dawn to begin his ranch work, while Josephine took charge of the cabin, cooking meals and keeping things in order. She expanded her garden work, adding herbs and flower beds around the cabin's perimeter. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence as the sun set over the Kansas prairie. She learned that Preston had grown up in Illinois, the son of a blacksmith, that he joined the Union Army at 18, serving through the entire war. That he'd come west seeking something he couldn't quite name: peace, perhaps, or purpose. He, in turn, learned about her life in Philadelphia, her father's shipping business that had flourished and then failed, her education at a ladies' seminary, her plans to become a teacher before her father's death had left her with his considerable debts. "How did you end up on that auction block?" Preston asked one evening as they sat watching fireflies rise from the grass, Josephine's hands stilled in her lap. "After my father died, his creditors came calling. I sold everything to pay them, but it wasn't enough. One man, Mr. Hargrove, offered to forgive the remaining debt if I would agree to travel west as a governess for a family he knew." She gave a bitter laugh. "I should have known better. When I reached Kansas City, a man met me at the station, said the family had changed their minds but that he knew of other opportunities. Before I understood what was happening, I was locked in a room with other women, all brought west under similar pretenses." Preston's face darkened with anger. "These men who did this, they should be held accountable. Perhaps, but they're careful to maintain the appearance of legality. The papers I signed, which I foolishly didn't read thoroughly, apparently indentured me to repay my father's debt through domestic service." She shook her head. "It was my own naivety that led me here." "No," Preston said firmly. "It was their predatory behavior and dishonesty. You trusted because you had no reason not to." His defense of her warmed something inside Josephine that had been cold for too long. "Thank you," she said softly. As days turned into weeks, Josephine found herself less eager to leave. The ranch began to feel like home, and Preston's quiet company became something she looked forward to each day. His hired hands, Tom and Micah, treated her with respect, tipping their hats when they saw her and thanking her earnestly for the meals she prepared when they ate at the main house. One hot July afternoon, Preston came in from working with the cattle to find Josephine at the stove, her hair escaping its pins, her face flushed from the heat. "You work too hard," he said, hanging his hat by the door. She smiled over her shoulder. "Says the man who's been in the saddle since sunrise." "That's different." "How so?" "It's my ranch, my responsibility." He poured water from the pitcher into a basin and washed his face and hands. "And the cabin is my responsibility, at least while I'm here," she replied, turning back to her cooking. Preston dried his face, studying her. "And how long might that be?" The question hung in the air between them. Josephine hadn't mentioned leaving in weeks, and Preston hadn't pressed the issue. Now, faced with the direct question, she found herself uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted. "I should be making plans, saving the wages you insist on paying me, but, he prompted when she trailed off. "But I'm happy here," she said simply, meeting his eyes. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Something shifted in Preston's expression, relief, perhaps, or hope. "I'm glad to hear that, Josie. I've grown accustomed to your presence." It wasn't a declaration of affection, but from the reserved Preston Jacobsen, it felt significant. Josephine smiled, turning back to the stove to hide the blush rising to her cheeks. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching a summer storm roll in across the prairie, Preston cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've been thinking," he began, "about your situation." Josephine tensed slightly. Was he finally going to suggest it was time for her to move on? "You've been here almost a month now," he continued, "and in that time, you've transformed this place. The cabin's never been so well kept, the garden's flourishing, even the hands comment on how much better everything runs with you here." "I'm glad to be useful," she said cautiously. "It's more than that, Josie. You belong here," he met her eyes. "I'd like you to stay. Permanently." Her heart quickened. "As what exactly?" Preston took a deep breath. "As my wife, if you'd consider it." Josephine stared at him, speechless. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, a proposal of marriage wasn't among them. "I know it's sudden," he rushed on when she didn't respond. "And I know I'm not the kind of man you probably envisioned marrying. I'm just a rancher with calloused hands and simple ways, but I respect you, Josie. I admire your strength and your kindness, and I think we could build a good life together." "Preston," she finally managed, "are you certain? You purchased my freedom. You don't need to marry me out of some sense of obligation, or, this has nothing to do with obligation," he interrupted gently. "And everything to do with the fact that I've grown to care for you deeply. If you don't feel the same, I understand. You're still free to go whenever you choose, with my blessing and whatever help I can provide." The first raindrops began to fall, pattering on the porch roof above them. Josephine studied Preston's face in the gathering dusk, his earnest expression, the vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept carefully hidden. "I care for you too, Preston," she said softly. "More than I expected to, but marriage is a serious step." "It is," he agreed. "And I wouldn't ask if I wasn't serious in my intentions." A gust of wind blew rain onto the porch, and they moved closer to the cabin wall to stay dry. Preston's hand found hers in the dim light, his touch gentle but sure. "Would you allow me to court you properly?" he asked. "Give us both time to be certain." Relief and something like joy flooded through Josephine. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." His smile in the darkness was brief but radiant. As the storm intensified around them, they sat side by side, hands intertwined, watching lightning illuminate the vast Kansas sky. The courtship of Preston Jacobsen and Josephine James was unlike any that might have taken place in Philadelphia society. There were no chaperoned walks in the park, no formal dinners or dance cards. Instead, there were shared meals and conversations, work done side by side, and moments of connection found in the rhythm of daily life. Preston took to bringing Josephine small gifts when he returned from town: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflower seeds for her garden. She, in turn, made his favorite dishes, mended his shirts with careful stitches, and listened attentively to his plans for the ranch. In August, he took her on a picnic to a hidden meadow on the far side of his property, where a small waterfall splashed into a clear pool. They spent the afternoon talking and laughing, Josephine barefoot in the shallows, Preston watching her with undisguised admiration. "I never thought I'd find this," he confessed as they sat side by side on a sun-warmed rock. "Find what?" she asked, turning to him. "This feeling, this contentment." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "After the war, I thought perhaps I wasn't meant for happiness. That I'd seen too much, done too much. And now," she prompted gently, his eyes met hers, summer sky blue and serious. "Now I think perhaps I was just waiting for you." Impulsively, Josephine leaned forward and pressed her lips to their first kiss. Preston froze for an instant, then responded with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I love you, Josie," he whispered. "I think I have since that day in Ellsworth, though I didn't recognize it then." "I love you too," she replied, the words both frightening and freeing to say aloud. "And I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I can't imagine being anywhere but by your side." They were married in September, a small ceremony in Ellsworth's church with Tom and Micah as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Preston had ordered specially from Kansas City, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Preston wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but handsome, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the meaning behind them was anything but conventional. A woman who had been sold at auction, promising herself freely to the man who had bought her freedom. A man who had lived alone, binding himself willingly to a woman who had chosen to stay. That evening, returning to the ranch, their home as husband and wife, Josephine felt a profound sense of rightness. Preston lifted her from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of the cabin, now decorated with fresh curtains she had sewn and flowers from her thriving garden. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jacobsen," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "It's been home for some time," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "But now it's official." Their wedding night was a revelation of tenderness and passion, Preston's strength tempered by his reverence for her, Josephine's uncertainty melting into trust and desire. They learned each other slowly, with wonder and occasional laughter, finding in their union a completion neither had known they were seeking. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight streamed through the window, Josephine marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From Philadelphia society to the brink of servitude, and now to this, a partnership of equals built on respect and love in the Kansas wilderness. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured against her hair. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied. "If my father hadn't died in debt, if I hadn't been desperate enough to trust Hargrove, if you hadn't come to town that day." If, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Too many coincidences to be mere chance, I think." "Are you suggesting Providence, Mr. Jacobsen?" she teased. "I'm suggesting that some things are meant to be, Mrs. Jacobsen," he replied. "And you and I are one of them." As autumn painted the prairie in russet and gold, Josephine and Preston settled into married life with surprising ease. The cabin that had once felt like Preston's alone now belonged to both of them, with touches of Josephine's presence throughout curtains at the windows, a quilt on their bed, flowers on the table even as the garden outside succumbed to frost. Preston expanded his herd, reinvesting the profits from the summer cattle drive into breeding stock. With Josephine's careful accounting, a skill from her father's business that proved unexpectedly useful on the ranch, they were able to hire a third hand, making the work less grueling for all. In November, as the first snow dusted the prairie, Josephine discovered she was with child. She told Preston on a Sunday morning as they lingered over coffee, watching snowflakes drift past the window. "I have something to tell you," she said, her hands cradling the warm cup. He looked up, eyebrows raised in question. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply. "In late spring, I think." Preston's face transformed with wonder. He set down his cup with careful deliberation, then moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" she asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," he said, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "I'm overcome, Josie, a family of our own." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing to stay, for making this place a home, for everything." The winter of 1874-75 was harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for days at a time. But inside the snug cabin, Josephine and Preston created their own warmth. In the evenings, he would read aloud while she sewed tiny garments for the baby, the firelight casting a golden glow over their domestic tableau. As Josephine's body changed with the growing child, Preston's protectiveness increased. He insisted on taking over her more strenuous chores, despite her protests that she wasn't an invalid. When the spring thaw came, revealing tender green shoots in her garden, she was grateful for the timing. By summer, when ranch work would be at its most demanding, she would have their child in her arms. May arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the prairie and increasing discomfort for Josephine. Her back ached constantly, her ankles swelled, and sleep became elusive. Yet she had never felt more vital, more connected to the fundamental rhythms of life. On a warm evening in late May, as she and Preston sat on the porch watching the sunset, she felt the first contraction, a tightening across her abdomen that took her breath away. "Preston," she said, gripping the arm of her chair, "I think it's time." The next hours were a blur of pain and determination. The midwife from a neighboring ranch arrived quickly, her experienced hands guiding Josephine through the labor. Preston was banished to the porch, where he wore a path in the boards with his pacing. Just as dawn broke over the eastern hills, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce his intention to take on life with vigor. The midwife cleaned and swaddled him before calling Preston inside. He entered tentatively, his face drawn with worry until he saw Josephine propped up in bed, tired but radiant, a small bundle in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice rough from hours of labor. Preston approached the bed as if in a dream, sinking down beside Josephine to gaze at the tiny, perfect face of their child. The baby's eyes were tightly shut, his skin still red and wrinkled, a shock of dark hair Josephine's color plastered to his head. "He's beautiful," Preston whispered, touching a finger to his son's cheek. "Perfect." "What shall we name him?" Josephine asked. Preston considered the tiny face before him. "What about William, after your brother?" Tears filled Josephine's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "William Preston Jacobsen," she said. "A good name for a strong boy." "A name to live up to," Preston agreed, his voice husky with emotion. The first year of William's life brought joy and exhaustion in equal measure. He was a healthy, active baby, quick to smile and determined in all his endeavors, from rolling over to crawling to taking his first unsteady steps just before his first birthday. The ranch prospered alongside their family. Preston's careful breeding program began to show results in the quality of his calves, and the vegetable garden that Josephine had rescued from neglect now produced enough to sell the surplus in town. They added a proper kitchen to the cabin, along with a nursery for William, and a second bedroom that would someday accommodate the siblings they hoped to give him. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch as a family, William toddling between them, learning the names of stars and the calls of night birds. Josephine would sometimes catch Preston watching them with an expression of such profound gratitude that it took her breath away. "What is it?" she asked one such evening as William dozed in her lap. "Just thinking about how different life might have been," he replied, "for all of us." She knew what he meant. Had he not intervened that day in Ellsworth, had she gone to Thorn or another bidder, her fate and William's very existence would have been dramatically altered. "We can't dwell on what might have been," she said softly. "Only be grateful for what is." Preston reached across to take her hand. "And I am grateful, Josie. Every day." As William grew from toddler to boy, the Jacobsen ranch grew alongside him. By his 5th birthday in 1880, they had nearly doubled their acreage and tripled their herd. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house, with a dedicated office where Josephine kept the ranch books and corresponded with cattle buyers across the Midwest. That summer also brought the arrival of William's sister, Elizabeth, born during a thunderstorm that had Preston trapped in the barn until the worst had passed. By the time he reached the house, soaked to the skin and frantic with worry, Josephine was already holding their daughter, a tiny girl with Preston's blue eyes and a dusting of golden hair. "She couldn't wait for you," Josephine said with a tired smile as Preston stared in awe at the new addition to their family. "Impatient, like her mother," he replied, bending to kiss them both. "William," now a serious 5-year-old with Josephine's dark hair and Preston's steady gaze, approached the bed cautiously to examine his sister. "She's very small," he observed. "You were that small once too," Preston told him, ruffling his son's hair. William looked skeptical. "I don't remember." "Well, you'll remember this day," Josephine said. "The day your sister joined our family." As the children grew, the rhythm of ranch life adapted to include them. William shadowed Preston from the moment he was old enough to sit a horse, soaking up knowledge of cattle and land management with a seriousness that belied his young age. Elizabeth, 3 years his junior, was equally determined but more inclined toward books and numbers, sitting beside Josephine in the office and learning to calculate feed costs before she could properly write her name. In the spring of 1883, when William was 7 and Elizabeth 4, Josephine discovered she was expecting their third child. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, with persistent nausea and fatigue that lingered well into the second trimester. "Perhaps we should hire a housekeeper to help you," Preston suggested one evening as he found her dozing over her mending. "Nonsense," she replied, straightening. "I'm perfectly capable of managing the house and children. And the ranch accounts and the garden and the correspondence with buyers," he added wryly. "You do the work of 3 people, Josie. There's no shame in accepting help." She relented eventually, and they hired Mrs. Calvert, a widow from town whose gentle manner and excellent cooking soon made her an indispensable part of the household. With Mrs. Calvert handling the domestic duties, Josephine was able to rest more and focus on the aspects of ranch management she most enjoyed. In December, as Christmas preparations filled the house with the scents of pine and cinnamon, Josephine gave birth to twin boys James and Thomas, identical save for a small mole on James's right shoulder. Preston, who had been present for this birth at Josephine's insistence, was rendered speechless by the arrival of 2 sons instead of the one they had expected. "Twins," he kept repeating as the midwife cleaned and swaddled the second baby. "2 of them, at once." Josephine, exhausted but exultant, laughed at his bewilderment. "It explains why I was so much larger this time." The twins completed their family in a way none of them had anticipated. William appointed himself their protector, while Elizabeth alternated between treating them as living dolls and being thoroughly exasperated by their constant demands for attention. As the years passed, the Jacobsen Ranch became known throughout Kansas not only for its fine cattle, but also for the family that ran it. Preston and Josephine were respected for their fair dealing and progressive ideas about ranching. Their children grew tall and straight, educated both in books and in the practical knowledge needed for life on the frontier. In 1890, as they celebrated 15 years of marriage, Preston surprised Josephine with a trip back east, her first return to Philadelphia since she had left in desperation all those years ago. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, and visited the few remaining friends from Josephine's former life. But after 2 weeks, they were both eager to return to Kansas, to the land and life they had built together. "It's strange," Josephine said as their train crossed the Mississippi, heading west toward home. "I once thought Philadelphia the center of all that was civilized and desirable. Now it seems so confined, so artificial." Preston smiled, squeezing her hand. "The city hasn't changed, Josie." "You have." She rested her head on his shoulder, watching the landscape gradually transform from forested hills to open prairie. "We have," she corrected. "Together." When they returned to the ranch, they found everything in perfect order. William, now 15 and nearly as tall as his father, had managed the daily operations with a maturity that made them both proud. Elizabeth had kept the books with her usual precision. Even the twins, at 7, had taken their responsibilities for the chickens and garden seriously. That night, after the children were asleep, Preston and Josephine sat on the porch as they had done countless evenings before. The prairie stretched before them, silver in the moonlight, the silhouettes of cattle visible on distant hills. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked suddenly. "Staying here, choosing this life?" Josephine turned to look at him, surprised by the question after all these years. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. Even in the beginning, when you were fresh from Philadelphia and everything here must have seemed so primitive." She considered this. "I was afraid in the beginning," she admitted. "Not of you, but of my own feelings, of allowing myself to trust again after being so thoroughly deceived." She took his hand, tracing the calluses and scars that told the story of their years together. "But I never regretted my decision to stay. From the moment you offered me freedom, I knew you were a man worth knowing, worth loving." Preston brought her hand to his lips, his kiss a silent acknowledgement of all they had built together. From the most unlikely beginning, an auction block in Ellsworth, a transaction that could have perpetuated bondage, but instead initiated freedom, they had created a life rich with purpose and love. As the years continued to pass, the Jacobsen ranch prospered under the combined efforts of the family. William, after studying agriculture at the college in Manhattan, Kansas, returned to work alongside his father, bringing new ideas about breeding and land management. Elizabeth, with her head for figures, expanded their operation into banking, establishing the Jacobsen Cattlemen's Bank in Ellsworth to serve the needs of local ranchers. The twins, James and Thomas, grew into young men with complementary talents, James with an engineer's mind that led to innovations in irrigation and fencing, Thomas with a gift for horses that resulted in a sideline breeding operation that soon rivaled the cattle business in profitability. By the turn of the century, Preston and Josephine were in their 50s, their hair streaked with silver, but their partnership as strong as ever. They had weathered droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations and family illnesses, each challenge serving to deepen their connection rather than strain it. On a golden autumn day in 1904, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together family, friends, and neighbors from across the county. Tables were set up in the shade of cottonwood trees, laden with food and drink. Children, their grandchildren now, 7 of them ranging from infancy to 10 years old, ran laughing through the grass. As evening approached, William stood to offer a toast to his parents. "To Preston and Josephine Jacobsen," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us not only how to run a ranch, but how to build a life of purpose and integrity. Who showed us that love can flourish in the most unexpected circumstances, and that freedom is not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice." Glasses were raised all around as Preston and Josephine, seated side by side as they had been for 3 decades, accepted the tribute with quiet dignity. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests departed, they found themselves once again on the porch of the house that had grown from a simple cabin to a comfortable home. The prairie stretched before them, bathed in the light of a harvest moon, the land they had worked together for so many years. 30 years, Preston mused, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "It hardly seems possible." "And yet here we are," she replied, leaning into his familiar embrace. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise higher in the sky. So much had changed since that day in Ellsworth. The frontier had been tamed. Railroads crisscrossed the state. Automobiles were beginning to appear even in rural Kansas. But the fundamental truth of their life together remained constant. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Josephine asked. When you untied my hands after the auction, Preston nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. You always have a choice, he quoted softly. That was the moment, she said. Right then, when I began to hope again. He turned to look at her, this woman who had come to him as a stranger and become the center of his world. At 52, Josephine was still beautiful to him, the lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth speaking of laughter and wisdom earned through a life fully lived. I bought your freedom, he said, but you gave me mine. She smiled, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered skin. And together, we built something neither of us could have imagined alone. As night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, two figures silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the windows of their home. The story of Preston and Josephine Jacobsen begun in desperation and chance, sustained by choice and commitment, continued to unfold beneath the vast Kansas sky. A testament to love's power to transform even the most unlikely beginnings into a life of profound meaning and joy.